My name is Anna. I'm sitting in a conference room filled with tension, the air thick with unspoken words and hidden agendas. Opposite me, my brother Ethan glares at me, his face red with anger and frustration. His wife Lily sits beside him, her eyes cold and calculating. Next to them is Marcus, my ex-fiancé, looking uncomfortable and out of place. And in the corner, Garrett Roth, a shrewd businessman, watches us all with a smug smile on his face. The room falls silent as I open the folder in front of me and begin to speak. There's nothing here for any of you to fight over. There hasn't been for 2 days. You just didn't check. I slide the first document into the middle of the table, turning it so they can read it. The recorder's stamp is bright in the corner. This is a conservation easement on the cabin parcel granted by donation, recorded against the title. It permanently prohibits mining, extraction, subdivision, and development forever. It binds me, and it binds every owner who ever comes after me. Roth's smile doesn't move, but his eyes widen slightly. I slide the second document beside it. This is a conveyance of the entire mineral estate into a charitable land trust with the Regional Native Corporation as a steward. As of 2 days ago, I don't own the minerals. No one does in the way you mean. They can't be bought, sold, or pulled out of the ground. Not by me, not by you, not by anyone. The room goes dead silent. Ethan's lawyer picks up the first page, reads it, sets it down, and doesn't pick up the second. He understands. I turn to Ethan, and I keep my voice as level as the floor my father hand planed. You're contesting a trust to win a fortune that no longer exists. The restriction is recorded against the land itself. Win or lose your case, it binds whoever ends up holding the deed. There's nothing under that ground you can reach. You'd spend 5 years and everything you have left to inherit a frozen creek you're not allowed to touch. I let that sink in. Then I look at Roth. Your notice of interest is against a parcel that can never be developed. It's worthless now. Exactly the way my father wanted it. And finally, I look at my brother and give him back his own words. You told me a shack tells me everything, Ethan. It did. You just never once asked what it was trying to tell you. As the room explodes in chaos, I'm taken back to the beginning of this whole ordeal. It all started last winter. My parents, Jack and Emily, had always been a bit eccentric. My father, Jack, was a quiet man with a deep love for the land. He grew up in a small town in the Alaskan wilderness, and he carried that love with him wherever he went. My mother, Emily, was more reserved, but she shared my father's passion for the outdoors. One Tuesday in October, my father called me. He said they were going to spend the winter on the land up in the Yukon country, where his ancestors came from. No phone, no radio checks, he said. Just the two of us, a cabin, and the dark coming down early. I wasn't worried. My father had a habit of disappearing into the wilderness for months at a time and coming back refreshed and happy. I ran my survey business out of a small office on Main Street. As the first snow buried our town, I went about my daily routine, waiting for my parents to return as they always did. But October turned into December, and December into a freezing January. The creek behind my house groaned all night like a living thing, and I found myself standing at the window, smelling the wood smoke and spruce that wasn't there, the smell of my father's cabin when I was a child. Then, in the second week of March, a letter came from an attorney named Sarah Thompson. The envelope was thick, and it scared me before I even opened it. I sat at my kitchen table for what felt like hours before I broke the seal. I knew deep down that my easy winter of pretending was over. Sarah's letter didn't say my parents were dead. It said something worse that nobody knew. I called her office the next morning, and she explained it all to me. My parents had set up a living trust years ago. They had pre-signed the transfer documents, deeds, and assignments, all notarized. The instructions stated that if they went out of communication past April 1st and no one could confirm they were alive, she was to deliver and record exactly what they had already signed. I asked her to wait. I told her my father had vanished into the bush a dozen times and always walked out in the spring. April 1st meant nothing out there, I said. But she was firm. The instrument doesn't bend, Miss Anderson. I'm holding paper they executed with their own hands. They built it that way on purpose. I asked to see the file, to know who'd witnessed it, who'd drafted it, and whether I could challenge the timing. She patiently answered all my questions, then quietly said that a person is allowed to set conditions on their own property, that the signatures were clean and properly witnessed, and that fighting my own parents' signed instructions would be an uphill battle in any Alaskan court. The reading of the trust took place in Fairbanks, in a conference room with terrible carpet and even worse coffee. Ethan flew up from Los Angeles in a coat too thin for the cold. Lily was beside him, wearing sunglasses that she didn't take off indoors. Marcus came with me, holding my hand, but I could feel that he was already pulling away. Sarah read the trust aloud. Ethan got a luxurious beachfront property in Los Angeles, valued at $2,500,000. I got a small cabin in the Yukon, 200 meters north of nowhere, a place that no one would ever go to on purpose. Ethan actually laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh, but one of relief, like a man who'd bet right. Lily's shoulders dropped a bit. I sat very still, counting the squares in the carpet. Marcus said, "There must be more." But there wasn't. Sarah slid the folders across the table. One was thick, and one was thin. The thin one was mine. Ethan leaned back and folded his hands behind his head. "Don't look like that, Anna. Dad gave me my lucky break." "He gave you a shack. That tells you everything." I didn't answer him. I'd learned long ago that sometimes, the quietest response can be the most powerful. On the drive back to Marcus's place in Fairbanks, he was silent. Once we were inside, the door shut, and the heat ticking in the vents, he exploded. He had a development deal stalled, a strip of land near the river, with permits going nowhere and a bank breathing down his neck. He'd been counting on what I'd inherit to save it. "I don't get it," he kept saying. "How do they leave you nothing?" I told him the cabin wasn't nothing. He laughed, and it was a cold laugh. "It's a frozen box of rot, Anna. It's worthless. Just like you're a pathetic loser. A frozen shack is exactly what you deserve." I didn't cry. I took the ring off my finger, set it on his counter, and walked out. In my pocket, my fingers found my father's old brass compass, the one he'd given me when I made my first survey on my own. The cold weight of it steadied my hand. I drove home to our town through black ice, not turning on the radio once. By the time I reached my door, I'd stopped feeling the insult. I'd started planning. I was going to see that so-called worthless shack with my own eyes. I packed a week's worth of supplies and headed north on my snow machine. Getting to the cabin wasn't easy. I had to charter a pilot named Tom, who'd flown my father for 25 years. He didn't ask why I was going. Bush pilots learn not to ask questions. He set me down on a gravel strip that wasn't on most maps and told me the weather was coming in 2 days. "You'll want to be off this ground before it does," he said. The first part of the journey was easy, but then the wind picked up. Snow lifted off the ground in sheets, erasing the horizon. I rode the last stretch by feel, following the line of stunted spruce that my father had taught me to follow when I was 10. My hands went numb inside 2 pairs of gloves, and my goggles iced over. But I didn't panic. Panic was a luxury I couldn't afford out there. Finally, I saw the cabin. It was small and leaning, just as everyone had described it. But the roof was sound, the shutters were tight, and the woodpile was stacked neatly. A man who didn't care wouldn't have kept it like that. Inside, the cabin was colder than the outside. I got a fire going in the old stove and stood over it until my fingers thawed. As I looked around, I realized this wasn't a place that had been abandoned. My father's old coat hung on a peg by the door, clean and brushed. A row of survey books stood on a shelf, their spines unbroken and dust-free. Maps covered one wall, pinned in neat rows. The smell of wood smoke and spruce hit me, and it brought back a flood of memories. I sat on the edge of the bunk and let it all wash over me. My father had not left this place to rot. He'd kept it like a sacred place. As I walked around the cabin, I noticed that one floorboard near the bunk gave way under my boot with a hollow sound. I shifted my weight back and forth and felt it flex. There was an empty space underneath. I crouched down and ran my thumb along the seam. Whatever was under there, my father had wanted it found by someone willing to come this far. I didn't pry it up right away. I needed a moment to connect with my father. I sat on the floor in the firelight and remembered all the times he'd taught me about the land. When I was 9, he'd caught me carving my initials into a tree. Instead of yelling, he'd asked me whose tree it was. Ours, I'd said. He'd shaken his head and told me, the land isn't ours to spend. We're only keeping it warm for the ones who come after. After a while, I found a flat bar in his toolkit and pried up the board. Beneath it was a roll of oil cloth tied with waxed cord. It was heavy when I lifted it. My hands were shaking as I untied the knots. When the cloth fell open, I couldn't believe my eyes. It was my father's survey work, but not just casual notes. It was decades of detailed mapping, topographic sheets layered over geological overlays, hand-inked and cross-referenced. Tucked into the center of the roll was a sealed envelope. Across the front, in my father's handwriting, it said, "For the one who comes to look, not for Ethan, not for Mom, for whoever cared enough to make the trip." I spread the maps across the floor and started to study them. My father hadn't just mapped the land, he'd sampled it. The drilled site notations were a methodical grid of core samples, each logged with depth and date. And against several of them, he'd marked symbols that I recognized from my own training, symbols that indicated mineralization and heavy concentration. He'd circled a formation that ran beneath the creek and out under the spruce flats, and beside it, he'd written confirm. Below that, a later date, and confirmed. I sat back on my heels. There was something valuable under this cabin. Something my father had known about and kept secret. Just then, my satellite phone started buzzing. Only a few people had that number. I answered, and it was Ethan. His voice was too warm, too interested. "Hey sis, just checking you got home okay from Fairbanks." I knew he was up to something. I told him I was fine. He asked if I was still at the cabin. I lied and said I was running errands. I didn't know why I lied, but my father's secrecy had rubbed off on me. Ethan said Lily thought I'd gone there looking for something. I kept my voice flat and said there was nothing up there but mice and old maps. He let it go too easily, and when he hung up, I knew someone had found out about my father's discovery. The next morning, an old man named Henry showed up at the cabin. He'd run trap lines with my father for 40 years. He looked at me and said, "You came." He'd seen the smoke from my stove and come to check. Over coffee, he looked at the map still spread across the floor and wasn't surprised. "Your dad talked about this ground his whole life. He used to tell me it wasn't for selling. Some things you keep, you don't spend." It was the same thing my father had told me when I was a child. Henry also told me that my father had tested everyone. 40 years ago, he'd offered to cut Henry in on something and watched what he'd do. Henry had told him to keep his secret and pour him more coffee. "You should read whatever he left you, Anna, and read it twice." That man never said a thing without meaning it. After Henry left, I finally read my father's letter. It was short and to the point. He wrote that if I was reading this, I'd come to the cabin, and that meant I was the kind of person he'd hoped one of his children would turn out to be. He wrote that the land held something valuable, that he'd spent his life confirming it, and would spend the rest of it protecting it. He also wrote, "Don't trust the number until you've sat with it. A number that big makes liars out of good people and fools out of the rest." Folded behind the letter was a single page on the letterhead of a geological assay firm from Anchorage. It was a preliminary report, with my father's name as the client. My eyes went straight to the bottom of the page, where someone had penciled an order of magnitude valuation in the margin. $500 million. My hand started to shake. I set the page down on the floor and pressed my palm over it, as if I could hold the number still. I realized that the worthless shack I'd inherited sat on top of more money than Ethan's mansion and Marcus's failed development deal combined. But my father's letter wasn't a celebration. It was a warning. He'd written, "What's under this ground could buy the world." That's exactly why no one can ever own it. Not sell it well. Not split it fair. No one can ever own it. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't sell this land. I had to protect it, just like my father had wanted. But I also knew that there were people who would try to stop me. A few days after I got home, a man named Garrett Roth called my office. He was direct. "Ms. Anderson, I think we both know what your father found." I pretended I didn't know what he meant. He chuckled and said he'd be in Fairbanks next week and that I'd want to talk before things got complicated. Then he dropped the bombshell. "I've already had a productive conversation with your brother Ethan." That same night, Ethan called. The salesman in him was gone. He was the entitled brother I'd grown up with. He said the trust distribution was starting to look questionable. No judge would believe Dad meant to leave his daughter a fortune in minerals while his son got a depreciating house in a flood-prone area. He said we should keep it in the family and split it fairly. When I asked what fair meant, he said 60 to 40, but wouldn't say which way. I told him, "You told me a shack tells me everything, Ethan." "It does, just not what you thought it did." 2 days later, a courier brought the paperwork. Ethan was contesting the trust, claiming I'd manipulated our parents. He was suing me for the right to help destroy the one thing our father had died trying to protect. Marcus also showed up on my doorstep one day, with flowers. He said he'd been awful to me and that he'd said things he didn't mean. He'd heard there might be more to the property than anyone realized and thought we could do something amazing together. I looked at him and said, "A pathetic loser with $500 million. He blinked, and I said, "Funny how the number changes what I'm worth to you." I told him I had a lawyer and to take his flowers. I called Sarah Thompson the next morning and asked her how I could legally make sure the land could never be mined, sold, or split. She walked me through it. Under Alaska law, I could grant a conservation easement, and the state and qualified land trusts could take it by donation. I could also convey the mineral estate into a charitable land trust. She warned me that it had to be a clean, informed decision, properly recorded. I assured her I'd do it right. I pulled the chain of title on the cabin parcel and discovered that my father had patented the parcel decades ago, with the mineral estate intact. He'd locked up the legal right to it before anyone else knew there was something to lock up. Just as I was ready to proceed, I learned that Roth had filed a notice of interest against the parcel. He was trying to freeze me in place. But I wasn't going to let him win. Roth flew up to Fairbanks and asked to meet. He was exactly what I expected: an expensive coat, soft hands, and a smile that had closed many deals. He bought me coffee and slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was an offer to buy the mineral rights for a life-changing amount of money. "Your father was a romantic," he said gently. "You don't have to be. Take the money, Miss Anderson. Buy your mother a nice house." But then the threat came. "Or don't, and spend the next 5 years in litigation with my fund and your brother, watching this eat your business and your savings until you settle for a fraction. I have time. People like you never do." I was scared, but I thought of the creek going orange, of my father on his knees on the tundra, and of his words about keeping the land for future generations. I stood up, buttoned my coat, and said, "Thank you for the coffee."